Kevin Costner spent most of his life being seen as a man who never blinked. A steady voice, a controlled presence, someone who looked like he always knew exactly where he was going. But when he finally walked away from the role that revived his career and restored his power, it wasn't sudden, and it wasn't simple. It was the final move in a chain of decisions that had been building for decades. And once you trace that chain carefully, the reason he left becomes impossible to separate from everything he lost along the way. The man who learned too early that success never stays. Kevin Costner's story has always been framed as a rise, a fall, and a comeback. But that framing misses something essential. His relationship with risk, obsession, and control began long before he became a Hollywood power player. Born in 1955 in Linwood, California, and raised in Compton, Costner didn't enter the industry through privilege or protection. After graduating college, he took whatever work he could find, driving trucks, working fishing boats, guiding tourists around Hollywood, and managing stages for years at Raleigh studios. While his peers were climbing ladders, his first paycheck was barely over $3 an hour. That early instability shaped him. It taught him that security could vanish overnight and that survival depended on self-reliance. When fame finally came in the late 80s, it came fast. The Untouchables and Bull Durham made him bankable, but Dances with Wolves transformed him into something else entirely, a director star with total creative authority. Winning Best Picture and Best Director wasn't just validation. It convinced Costner that trusting his own instincts, especially when others doubted him, was not only justified, but necessary. He had beaten better-known filmmakers. He had beaten Goodfellas. That victory stayed with him, but confidence soon hardened into something riskier. Only a few years later, Costner poured himself into Waterworld, an ambitious production plagued by delays, technical disasters, and a ballooning budget that spiraled far beyond control. He ignored warnings from seasoned filmmakers, including Steven Spielberg, about shooting on open water. He invested millions of his own money, and while the film eventually earned back some revenue over time, the damage was already done. His reputation shifted. He was no longer just a visionary. He was labeled difficult, expensive, and reckless. At the same time, his personal life collapsed. His marriage to Cindy Silva ended after 16 years, while Waterworld was still consuming him. He later admitted the failure was his own. 3 young children, a public divorce, and a film blamed for costing studios over $100 million in losses all collided at once. Costner survived it, but the lesson he absorbed wasn't caution. The lesson was defiance. He learned that even when everything goes wrong, walking away from your vision feels worse than losing money, status, or relationships. And that belief would quietly follow him for the rest of his career, waiting for the moment it would cost him far more than Waterworld ever did, when control became the only thing he trusted. After Waterworld, Kevin Costner told himself he had survived the worst. The money could be earned back. The headlines would fade. What mattered was that he had stayed true to his instincts. That belief hardened when he made The Postman, another film he directed, produced, and starred in, a post-apocalyptic epic he genuinely believed was good, even as critics tore it apart and audiences stayed away. The reaction to The Postman wasn't just negative, it was humiliating. The film was labeled self-indulgent and out of touch, winning multiple Razzie Awards and becoming shorthand in Hollywood for unchecked ego. Costner later admitted he could tell when a movie was honest, but not when it would be a hit. What he didn't admit, at least publicly, was how deeply the industry's rejection cut him. After 2 massive creative gambles backfired, studios no longer saw him as a safe investment. Scripts slowed, offers became smaller, trust evaporated. Throughout the early 2000s, his career drifted. Films came and went with little impact. Projects that once would have been prestige releases became footnotes. For a man who had once defined Hollywood masculinity, invisibility was the quiet punishment. Costner didn't disappear, but he stopped being central. And for someone wired to lead, that was its own kind of loss. What sustained him during that period wasn't success, it was endurance. He continued working even through physical pain, famously shooting scenes while dealing with kidney stones, hooked to IV morphine between takes. He never missed a day. That mattered to him. Discipline became his proof of worth when acclaim was gone. Then came moments of personal grief that deepened his emotional isolation. The death of Whitney Houston devastated him in a way few people expected. He spoke at her funeral not as a co-star, but as someone who had carried her struggles quietly for years. Love, loyalty, and promises kept even when the world misunderstood them. Those themes began to define how Costner saw himself. By the time he finally returned to the spotlight with Hatfields and McCoys and later with Yellowstone, he wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was chasing something harder to articulate: restoration, control over narrative, a chance to rebuild his image on his own terms. Yellowstone gave him that chance. It returned power, respect, and authority. And quietly, it also gave him the confidence to believe, once again, that his instincts should never be compromised. That belief set the stage for everything that followed. Yellowstone gave him power, then took away his time. When Kevin Costner agreed to lead Yellowstone, it was not supposed to redefine his life. At that point, his film career had stabilized but not fully recovered. Television was still seen, quietly, as a step down for movie stars of his generation. What he didn't expect was that the series would not only revive his relevance, it would make him indispensable again. From the moment the show aired, Yellowstone became a cultural force. Viewership climbed into the tens of millions. Costner's character, John Dutton, wasn't just popular, he became symbolic. He represented authority, tradition, and moral certainty in a world that felt increasingly unstable. With that came power. Costner was no longer a former Oscar winner trying to stay relevant. He was the anchor of the biggest series on television, earning over $1 million per episode and commanding a level of respect he hadn't felt in decades. But the success came with a cost that grew heavier each season. The production schedule was relentless. Filming stretched for months every year, often running far beyond its original timeline. For most actors, that was the job. For Costner, it became a problem. He had never been someone who compartmentalized his life easily. When he committed completely. Yellowstone didn't just occupy his calendar, it controlled it. Behind the scenes, something else was stirring. For over 30 years, Costner had been carrying a project he believed defined him more than any role he'd ever played. Horizon wasn't an idea he casually revisited. It was the story he believed he was meant to tell, a sweeping chronicle of the American West that lived in his head since before Dances with Wolves. Studios didn't believe in it. They wanted changes. They wanted limits. He refused all of it. Yellowstone's success gave him leverage, but it also trapped him. As the show's schedule slipped later and later into the year, the gaps he planned to use for Horizon kept disappearing. Scripts arrived late. Filming plans shifted. He waited for clarity that never came. By the time the 5th season approached, Costner was facing a choice he had spent his entire career avoiding: commit fully to someone else's vision or finally risk everything for his own. Tensions rose. Reports surfaced of disputes over control, scheduling, and creative authority. Costner said the delays made planning impossible. Others said he wanted too much control. What mattered wasn't who was right, it was that trust had eroded. When he returned to the set in an attempt to make it work, there was no script waiting for him. For someone who believed everything started with writing, that moment confirmed his worst fear. Yellowstone had given him power, but it no longer gave him certainty. And for Kevin Costner, uncertainty was something he had learned long ago to escape at any cost, the choice that triggered the collapse. By the time Kevin Costner made his final decision, it no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt like a countdown. Yellowstone wanted certainty he couldn't give. Horizon demanded time he no longer had. And for a man who had spent decades believing that compromise was the beginning of failure, the choice became brutally clear. Costner didn't leave Yellowstone because he stopped caring about the show. He left because he believed staying would erase the last chance he had to define his career on his own terms. Horizon was not just another project. It was the story he had been carrying since the late 80s, a multi-part Western epic about the settlement of the American West after the Civil War. Studios had passed on it repeatedly. They didn't believe audiences would commit to a long, serialized theatrical Western. They wanted creative control. They wanted safeguards. Costner refused every condition, so he did what very few actors his age would dare to do. He financed it himself. He mortgaged his waterfront estate in Santa Barbara. He poured tens of millions of dollars into the production. By the time filming began, his personal investment had climbed far beyond early estimates, eventually reaching roughly $38 million, with later disclosures suggesting even higher exposure. Financial advisors warned him. His accountant reportedly panicked. Even his family felt the strain. But Costner believed the Yellowstone audience would follow him. If only a fraction of those millions bought tickets, Horizon would survive. That belief became the justification for walking away from over $1 million per episode. It was not arrogance in his mind. It was necessity. He had waited too long. He was too old to delay again. This was the last window. When he announced he wouldn't return, the fallout was immediate. Yellowstone wrote his character out decisively. The show moved forward without him. Public perception shifted. Reports of tension on set surfaced. Stories of clashes, control disputes, and damaged relationships followed him into the press. The image of the steady leader cracked. At the same time, his personal life unraveled. His marriage ended in a public bitter divorce that played out in courtrooms and headlines. Child support battles became numbers instead of emotions. Trust collapsed at home just as it did at work. Then Horizon arrived, and the audience didn't. The opening numbers were devastating. The box office returns fell far short of expectations. Reviews questioned the structure, the length, the ambition. The sequel's theatrical release was pulled. Lawsuits followed. Creditors appeared. What Costner had believed would restore his legacy instead exposed how fragile everything had become. Leaving Yellowstone was not the mistake. It was the ignition. Once he chose Horizon over stability, every unresolved fracture in his life broke open at once. Career, marriage, finances, reputation, all tied to a single decision made under the weight of decades of belief. What he was really walking away from. By the time Kevin Costner stood back and looked at the wreckage, the question was no longer about Yellowstone. It was about identity. The lawsuits, the financial strain, and the public scrutiny all arrived in rapid succession, each one compounding the last, turning a professional gamble into a personal reckoning. As Horizon struggled to survive, a far more serious challenge emerged. A stunt performer from the production filed a lawsuit accusing Costner and the film's producers of subjecting her to an unscripted, non-consensual assault scene that violated industry safety and intimacy protocols. Costner denied the allegations forcefully, calling them false and deeply damaging. But a judge allowed the case to proceed, ensuring that the story would not fade quietly. For a man who had once said his name mattered more than money, the damage cut deep. His reputation, carefully rebuilt over decades, was now under threat in a way no box office failure ever could be. At the same time, financial pressure tightened. Horizon's losses were no longer abstract numbers. Vendors sued for unpaid fees. Banks pursued arbitration. The mortgage on his Santa Barbara estate became symbolic of how much he had put on the line. Insiders described him as overwhelmed, trying to keep the project alive while fighting on multiple legal fronts. The dream that was supposed to define his legacy had instead become a source of constant crisis management. And yet, even then, Costner didn't retreat. He continued to insist he would finish the saga. He spoke about belief, about fear, about showing his children that standing by your convictions mattered, even when the outcome was uncertain. To some, that sounded noble. To others, it sounded like denial. The line between courage and obsession had blurred completely. So why did he leave? Not just Yellowstone, but the safety it represented. Kevin Costner didn't walk away because he wanted more money, or less work, or more control. He walked away because staying would have meant accepting that the version of himself who once trusted his instincts above all else was finished. Yellowstone asked him to be a piece of something larger. Horizon asked him to be everything. What he chose wasn't a show over a film. It was belief over security, vision over comfort. And now, at an age when most legacies are sealed, he's living with the consequences of choosing the harder truth over the safer ending. So was Kevin Costner brave for betting everything on his vision, or reckless for refusing to listen when the warnings were clear? Do you think leaving stability for belief is worth the cost when there's no guarantee of redemption? Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold turning points of Hollywood lives.